December 17, 2010. City Bouzid, Tunisia, a small city in the interior forgotten by the coastal elite. Mohamed Bouazizi, a 26-year-old street vendor, sets up his cart as he does every morning, selling fruits and vegetables to support his widowed mother and siblings. A policewoman approaches, demanding a bribe he cannot afford to pay. When he refuses, she confiscates his scales, slaps him publicly, and insults his dead father. Humiliated beyond endurance, Bouazizi goes to the provincial governor's office to complain. He's turned away. At 11:30 a.m. in front of the building, Mohamed Bouazizi douses himself in paint thinner and strikes a match. His self-immolation will spark a revolution. Within weeks, Tunisia's dictator will flee. Within months, uprisings will sweep the Arab world. Rulers who had seemed untouchable for decades will fall. Millions will take to the streets demanding dignity, freedom, and justice. The world will watch, breathless with hope that democracy is finally coming to the Middle East. But the aftermath will bring civil wars, military coups, and return to autocracy. The Arab Spring will become an Arab winter, then an endless nightmare for millions. This is the story of the greatest wave of protests the Middle East has ever seen. How it began with one man's desperate act, why it spread like wildfire across a region, what it achieved and what it destroyed, and why its promises remain unfulfilled more than a decade later. To understand the Arab Spring, we must understand what came before. By 2010, the Arab world was trapped in what scholars called authoritarian resilience. Dictators ruled most countries: Egypt's Hosni Mubarak for 29 years, Tunisia's Zine El Abidine Ben Ali for 23 years, Libya's Muammar Gaddafi for 41 years, Syria's Assad family for 40 years, Yemen's Ali Abdullah Saleh for 32 years. These regimes seemed permanent, backed by powerful security services, military forces, and often Western support. The regimes shared characteristics. They concentrated wealth in ruling families and connected elites, while most people struggled economically. Youth unemployment was catastrophic: 30%, 40%, even 50% in some countries. College graduates drove taxis or sat idle. Housing was unaffordable. Inflation consumed wages. Economic liberalization enriched cronies while ordinary people fell behind. The social contract, accept dictatorship in exchange for economic stability, was breaking down. Political rights were non-existent. Elections were rigged farces. Opposition parties were banned or neutered. Media was controlled. Security services monitored everything. Speaking against the government meant prison, torture, or death. Corruption was endemic. Police demanded bribes, officials stole public funds, regime families looted national wealth. People felt powerless, voiceless, humiliated. The regimes portrayed themselves as bulwarks against Islamic extremism. After 9/11, Western governments, especially America, accepted this logic. They supported Arab dictators as allies in the war on terror, overlooking human rights abuses. Democracy promotion rhetoric was just that, rhetoric. Stability meant maintaining friendly autocrats. Social media was changing the equation. By 2010, Facebook had millions of Arab users, particularly young, educated urbanites. Twitter was spreading. YouTube allowed video sharing. Satellite television, especially Al Jazeera, launched in 1996, brought uncensored news to Arabic-speaking audiences. These technologies let people communicate, organize, and share information beyond government control. They created virtual spaces for dissent impossible in physical space. But technology alone doesn't cause revolutions. Revolutions need grievances, organization, opportunity, and often a spark. Mohamed Bouazizi's self-immolation was that spark. Bouazizi had been supporting his family since age 10 after his father died. The street vendor license he needed cost bribes he couldn't afford. Police harassment was constant. On December 17, being slapped by a female official, in a culture where this was particularly humiliating for a man, and having his complaints ignored broke him. Bouazizi died of his burns on January 4, 2011, But his act ignited something. Videos of his self-immolation spread on Facebook. Protests erupted in Sidi Bouzid, then spread to other cities. Protesters chanted employment, freedom, dignity. They filmed police brutality on phones and uploaded it. Al Jazeera broadcast the footage. The world watched. President Ben Ali initially dismissed the protests, then promised reforms, then cracked down violently. But the protests grew. Middle class joined the poor. Lawyers marched in their robes. Trade unions called general strikes. Crucially, the military refused to fire on protesters. On January 14, 2011, Ben Ali fled to Saudi Arabia, ending 23 years of rule. Tunisia's revolution succeeded in 28 days. A dictator who had seemed untouchable was gone. The impossible had become possible. If it could happen in Tunisia, it could happen anywhere. Egypt was next. Hosni Mubarak had ruled since 1981, surviving through emergency law that gave security forces unlimited power. Egypt was a police state. Mubarak's regime had 1.4 million security personnel monitoring 80 million people. The military controlled vast economic interests. Mubarak was grooming his son Gamal to succeed him, effectively establishing a dynasty. But Egypt had a history of activism. The Kefia movement had been organizing against Mubarak since 2004. Labor strikes were increasingly common. A Facebook page called "We Are All Called" said, commemorating a young man beaten to death by police, had hundreds of thousands of followers. Activists had been planning for revolution for years, studying nonviolent resistance tactics and organizing networks. Inspired by Tunisia, Egyptian activists called for protests on January 25, 2011, National Police Day, deliberately chosen. Nobody expected what happened. Tens of thousands came out in Cairo, Alexandria, and other cities, overwhelming police. Protesters occupied Tahrir Square in central Cairo, turning it into a liberated space, a miniature democratic society with medical stations, food distribution, and people from all backgrounds united. Mubarak deployed police who fired tear gas and rubber bullets. Protesters stood their ground. On January 28, the Friday of anger, the government shut down the internet and mobile networks. It backfired. Unable to follow events online, more people went to the streets to see for themselves. Millions protested nationwide. The regime sent thugs on camels and horses to attack Tahrir Square protesters in the Battle of the Camel on February 2. Protesters defended themselves. Images of men on camels attacking peaceful demonstrators with whips and clubs were broadcast worldwide. International pressure on Mubarak intensified. For 18 days, Egypt held its breath. Would the military intervene? Would there be a massacre? Mubarak tried concessions, dismissing his government, promising not to run again, but protesters demanded his immediate resignation. The chant echoed through Tahrir, "Erhol, leave." On February 11, 2011, Vice President Omar Suleiman announced Mubarak's resignation. The military had finally withdrawn support. Tahrir Square erupted in celebration. After 30 years, Mubarak was gone. Egypt had done it non-violently. Democracy seemed within reach. The revolutions were contagious. Across the Arab world, people took to the streets. The slogans were remarkably similar. The people want the fall of the regime. Bread, freedom, social justice, dignity. In Libya, protests began in Benghazi on February 15, 2011. Muammar Gaddafi, the eccentric dictator who had ruled since 1969, responded with extreme violence. His forces fired on protesters with heavy weapons. He gave a rambling speech calling protesters rats and cockroaches, promising to hunt them house by house. Libya descended into civil war. Unlike Tunisia and Egypt, Libya's military fractured. Parts defected to the opposition. Cities fell to rebels, then were retaken by regime forces. Gaddafi's troops advanced on Benghazi, promising a massacre. Civilians fled in panic. The international community, galvanized by Rwanda genocide guilt and responsibility to protect doctrine, intervened. UN Security Council Resolution 1973 authorized all necessary measures to protect civilians. NATO launched airstrikes on March 19, destroying Gaddafi's armor and air force. The intervention was controversial. Was it protecting civilians or pursuing regime change? The civil war raged for months. Rebels slowly gained ground with NATO air support. In August, they captured Tripoli. Gaddafi fled, was captured in October hiding in a drainage pipe, and was killed by rebels, lynched actually, in graphic footage that spread online. Libya was liberated, but what would replace Gaddafi's 42-year rule? Syria's uprising began in March 2011 in Daraa, where security forces arrested and tortured teenagers for writing anti-regime graffiti. When parents protested, security forces shot them. Protests spread nationwide. Bashar al-Assad, who had inherited power from his father in 2000, promised reforms but simultaneously cracked down brutally. Assad's regime was more cohesive than others. The military and security services, dominated by Assad's Alawite minority sect, remained loyal. Assad had regional allies, Iran and Lebanon's Hezbollah. Russia provided diplomatic cover and eventually military support. Assad calculated that he could survive through violence. What began as peaceful protests became armed conflict. Defectors formed the Free Syrian Army. Foreign fighters joined. The opposition fragmented into hundreds of groups. Assad's forces shelled civilian areas. Chemical weapons were used. Barrel bombs were dropped on neighborhoods. Syria descended into catastrophic civil war. Yemen's uprising began in January 2011, inspired by Tunisia and Egypt. Protesters demanded President Ali Abdullah Saleh's resignation after 33 years in power. Saleh tried to cling on, alternating between concessions and crackdowns. In June 2011, a bomb attack on his palace severely injured him. He left for medical treatment in Saudi Arabia. But Saleh returned and violence intensified. After months of stalemate, a Gulf Cooperation Council deal gave Saleh immunity in exchange for stepping down. His vice president took over in February 2012, but Yemen's problems, poverty, tribalism, sectarian divisions, remained. The Houthi movement, representing Yemen's Zaydi Shia minority, grew stronger. Saudi Arabia and Iran backed opposing sides. Yemen slid towards civil war. Bahrain's uprising revealed the sectarian fault lines underlying Arab Spring optimism. Protests began on February 14, 2011, the Day of Rage. Bahrain's majority Shia population protested against discrimination by the ruling Sunni monarchy. Protesters occupied Pearl Roundabout in the capital Manama, creating a Tahrir-style protest camp. The regime cracked down violently on February 17, killing protesters and destroying the protest camp, but demonstrations continued. On March 14, Saudi Arabia and UAE sent troops to support Bahrain's monarchy. The Gulf states would not allow revolution to succeed. The uprising was crushed. Hundreds were arrested and tortured. Opposition leaders were imprisoned. Bahrain's spring ended in repression. Morocco and Jordan experienced protests, but their monarchies survived through reforms and concessions. Morocco's King Mohammed VI allowed constitutional reforms and elections. Jordan's King Abdullah dismissed governments and promised changes. These monarchies were seen as more legitimate than republican dictatorships. Their security forces stayed loyal. The revolution stopped at their borders. Algeria and Sudan had protests, but regimes weathered them. Iraq, already in chaos after the U.S. invasion, experienced protests focused on corruption and services. Lebanon and the Palestinian territories had their own conflicts superseding the Arab Spring narrative. The revolutions weren't universal, and outcomes varied dramatically. The initial optimism was intoxicating. Dictators were falling, people power worked, democracy was coming, social media was liberating the masses. This was the Arab world's 1989 moment, comparable to Eastern Europe's communist collapse. The end of history was finally reaching the Middle East. Western media celebrated. Time magazine's 2011 Person of the Year was the protester. Obama gave speeches supporting democracy. The phrase Arab Spring itself, borrowed from the 1968 Prague Spring, suggested blooming freedom. Comparisons to the American Revolution and French Revolution were common. But this optimism was naive. Revolutions are easier than building democracies. Removing dictators doesn't automatically create freedom. The Arab Spring would demonstrate this brutally. Tunisia, the revolution's birthplace, became the success story, but barely. After Ben Ali fled, Tunisia held free elections in October 2011. The moderate Islamist party Ennahda won. A democratic constitution was drafted through contentious negotiations. Secular parties and Islamists compromised. Tunisia held multiple democratic elections, transferred power peacefully, and avoided civil war. Tunisia's economy remained weak. Youth unemployment stayed high. Terrorist attacks, most notably in 2015 killing dozens of tourists, damaged the crucial tourism sector. Many Tunisians grew disillusioned. The democracy worked institutionally but didn't deliver prosperity or justice. In July 2021, President Kais Saied suspended parliament and assumed emergency powers, effectively ending Tunisia's democratic experiment. The Arab Spring's only success story collapsed. Egypt's transition failed more quickly. After Mubarak fell, the military, the Supreme Council of Armed Forces (SCAF), took power, promising to shepherd democracy. Elections were held in 2011-2012. The Muslim Brotherhood, Egypt's oldest and best-organized opposition movement, won. Mohamed Morsi became president in June 2012. But Morsi governed poorly. He pushed through an Islamist constitution, granted himself excessive powers, and alienated secular opposition. The economy worsened. Fuel and food shortages caused frustration. Liberals who'd opposed Mubarak now feared Islamist domination. On June 30, 2013, massive protests demanded Morsi's resignation. Millions filled streets, possibly more than had protested against Mubarak. On July 3, 2013, the military, led by General Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, overthrew Morsi in a coup. Sisi claimed he was responding to popular will, but it was unambiguously a military coup. The military violently suppressed Muslim Brotherhood supporters. On August 14, 2013, security forces massacred protesters at Rabaa al-Adawiya Square in Cairo, killing at least 817 people, possibly over 1,000, one of the 21st century's worst single-day massacres. Thousands of Brotherhood members and supporters were arrested. Morsi was imprisoned and died in custody in 2019 under suspicious circumstances. Sisi became president in 2014 through an election widely criticized as unfair. His regime was more repressive than Mubarak's. Tens of thousands were imprisoned. Dissent was crushed. The revolution had come full circle. One dictator replaced another, this time with revolutionary legitimacy exhausted and society more divided. Libya collapsed into chaos. After Gaddafi's fall, no central authority emerged. The country fragmented. Militias controlled different regions. Two rival governments, one in Tripoli, one in Tobruk, both claimed legitimacy. Islamist militias, including ISIS, established territories. The country became a failed state, with weapons and fighters flowing to conflicts across the region. The NATO intervention had removed a dictator but left nothing functional in his place. Syria became the Arab Spring's worst catastrophe. Assad's brutal response turned peaceful protests into civil war. By 2012, the conflict was a multi-sided nightmare. Assad's forces fought rebels. Rebels fought each other. ISIS emerged from the chaos, conquering territory and declaring a caliphate in 2014. Kurdish forces fought for autonomy. External powers poured in, Russia and Iran supporting Assad, Turkey and Gulf states supporting rebels. America leading a coalition against ISIS. Chemical weapons were used repeatedly. Assad's forces dropped barrel bombs on civilian areas. Entire cities, Homs, Aleppo, were destroyed. Millions became refugees, fleeing to Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and Europe. The 2015 European refugee crisis was partly Syria's spillover. Over 500,000 people died. 13 million were displaced. Syria became a humanitarian catastrophe and geopolitical chessboard, where regional and global powers pursued their interests over Syrian suffering. Yemen's civil war became a proxy conflict. After Sail's departure, his former allies, the Houthis, rebelled against his successor. In 2015, Saudi Arabia led a coalition intervening to restore the internationally recognized government. The Houthis, supported by Iran, controlled the capital and much of the north. The war became a Saudi-Iranian proxy conflict, with devastating consequences for Yemeni civilians. Saudi airstrikes, often using American weapons, killed thousands of civilians. A coalition blockade caused famine and disease outbreaks. Yemen suffered the world's worst humanitarian crisis, millions facing starvation, cholera epidemics, collapsing healthcare. The war continues today, with no end in sight. Why did the Arab Spring fail so catastrophically? Multiple factors explain it. First, removing dictators was easier than building democracies. Revolutionaries united against tyranny but had no consensus on what should replace it. Islamists, liberals, secularists, socialists, all opposed dictators but disagreed fundamentally about governance. Once dictators fell, these differences erupted. Second, institutions were weak or non-existent. Decades of dictatorship had prevented independent judiciaries, free press, civil society, and political parties from developing. There were no democratic traditions to fall back on. The only strong institution was usually the military, which seized power when chaos threatened. Third, economic problems weren't solved by democracy. Youth unemployment, corruption, inequality, the grievances that sparked uprisings, persisted. Democracy doesn't automatically create jobs or growth. Disillusionment came quickly when economic conditions didn't improve or worsened. Fourth, sectarian and tribal divisions were deeper than revolutionary solidarity. Bahrain's Sunni-Shia divide, Syria's Alawite-Sunni tensions, Yemen's regional and tribal conflicts, these identities proved more powerful than shared desire for freedom. Dictators had suppressed these divisions. Their removal unleashed them. Fifth, external interference was decisive. Saudi Arabia and UAE crushed uprisings threatening monarchies. They supported counter-revolution in Egypt and backed military coups. Iran supported Assad and Houthi rebels. Turkey pursued its own agenda. Russia intervened militarily in Syria. Western powers, after initial support, stood aside as revolutions failed or intervened inconsistently. The Arab Spring became a battleground for regional and global power politics. Sixth, violence begot more violence. Regimes responded brutally to protests, radicalizing oppositions. Peaceful protesters were killed, so survivors took up arms. This justified further repression. Cycles of violence spiraled. Syria's tragedy demonstrates this. Assad's violence turned peaceful uprising into civil war, which invited foreign intervention, which prolonged conflict indefinitely. Finally, the hope for Twitter revolutions was naive. Social media helped organize protests and spread information, but it couldn't build institutions, negotiate compromises, or govern countries. Technology was neutral. Regimes also used it for surveillance and propaganda. ISIS recruited online. Disinformation spread as easily as truth. The Arab Spring revealed brutal truths. Democracy can't be imposed or imported. It must be built from within, requiring institutional foundations, compromise, tolerance, and time. Removing dictators is necessary but insufficient. Economic development matters as much as political freedom. External powers often oppose democracy when it threatens their interests. Violence, once unleashed, is nearly impossible to contain. Yet dismissing the Arab Spring as total failure is wrong. Millions of people, for the first time, exercised agency and demanded dignity. They proved that dictators weren't invincible. They experienced collective action and solidarity. These memories persist. In 2019, a second wave of Arab Spring protests erupted. Algeria's president was forced out after massive protests. Sudan's dictator Omar al-Bashir was overthrown by protests and military pressure. Lebanon experienced unprecedented cross-sectarian protests against corruption. Iraq saw massive demonstrations. These movements echoed 2011's themes: dignity, justice, accountability. But these protests also faced repression. Sudan's transition struggled. Lebanon's collapse continued. Iraq's protests were violently suppressed. The 2019 wave showed that the grievances driving 2011's uprisings, corruption, unemployment, inequality, authoritarianism, remained unresolved. The Arab Spring's legacy is contested and painful. It destroyed the myth of authoritarian stability. Dictators who seemed permanent fell within weeks. It showed people power's potential and limits. It inspired global movements: Occupy Wall Street, Spain's Indignados, movements worldwide, borrowed Arab Spring tactics and language. But it also produced immense suffering. Hundreds of thousands dead in Syria, Yemen, Libya, millions of refugees, failed states, resurgent authoritarianism, the rise of ISIS, which exploited power vacuums, a humanitarian catastrophe unprecedented in the region since World War II. For participants, it's deeply personal. Some remain proud of standing for dignity even if they lost. Others feel betrayed by military coups, foreign interventions, sectarian violence, or counter-revolutions. Many left as refugees, watching from abroad as their countries burned. Activists languish in prisons. Families mourn loved ones killed. Mohamed Bouazizi became a symbol, though he didn't intend to start a revolution. He just wanted dignity and the ability to support his family. His self-immolation resonated because millions felt similar desperation and humiliation. His act gave voice to voiceless millions. The question, was the Arab Spring worth it, is impossible to answer objectively. For Syrians living through a decade of civil war, the answer might be no. For Tunisians who experienced years of democracy before its recent collapse, perhaps yes. For Egyptians who protested Mubarak, were euphoric at his fall, then watched military dictatorship return, the answer is complicated. What's certain is that the Arab Spring wasn't a singular event but a process still unfolding. The forces it unleashed, demands for dignity, justice, and freedom, sectarian conflicts, regional power struggles, refugee crises, continue shaping the Middle East and world. The regimes that survived didn't return to the pre-2011 status quo. They're more repressive, more paranoid, less tolerant of dissent. They learned that early, brutal crackdowns work better than gradual reform. They invested in surveillance technology and social media manipulation. They portrayed themselves as bulwarks against chaos. Look at Syria, they say. That's what happens when you challenge authority. But the fundamental problems, corruption, unemployment, inequality, lack of freedom, persist and worsen. New generations grow up in these systems, facing bleak futures. The grievances that exploded in 2011 haven't been addressed. They've been suppressed, not solved. History suggests that suppression works until it doesn't. From Mohamed Bouazizi's desperate act to the ongoing Syrian tragedy, from Tahrir Square's euphoria to Sisi's repression, from the fall of multiple dictators to their replacement by new autocrats or chaos, the Arab Spring is a story of hope and horror, of people power and its brutal suppression, of revolution's promise and the agonizing difficulty of fulfilling it. The Arab Spring showed that people can overthrow tyrants, but that freedom is harder to build than tyranny is to destroy. It demonstrated that dignity and justice are worth risking everything for, even when the outcome is uncertain. It proved that the desire for freedom is universal, not culturally specific. And it revealed the tragic gap between aspiration and reality, between revolution's hope and its aftermath. More than a decade later, most Arab Spring countries are worse off than in 2010. But the memory of what people achieved, overthrowing dictators, experiencing solidarity, demanding dignity, can't be erased. The regimes know this. That's why they're so repressive. They fear their people, and they should, because what happened once can happen again. The only question is when and whether next time will turn out differently.